Okay, so last time we talked about the original meaning of science. It comes from the Latin word scientia, which means the knowledge of things through its causes. Knowledge of things through their causes. Okay, through knowledge of their causes. So then we talked about the four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. So review those. You need to know those. And um, then we talked about analogy. So quickly, analogy again is between univocity and equivocity. Okay, equivocity is when a word means two different things at the same time, or a concept is referring to two completely dissimilar things, completely different things. All right, and univocity is the opposite, where the concept applies equally to every member of its class. So, like animal, cats are equally animals as dogs are. One isn't more animal than the other. And then analogy is where there's both similarity and dissimilarity between the things you're talking about. Okay. So, for example, I might say that I'm healthy. The doctor might look at my urine and say your urine is healthy because the urine, good health. If the urine has certain properties, it's a sign of good health. Doctor might also say, this is healthy medicine. This is good medicine. This medicine will make you healthy. It'll be the cause of health. Okay? So you can use health in three different ways there. And there are lots of different cases where you could do that, with different words, I mean. And that's what's called an analogous concept, or an analogous term. Okay? So the analogy of being is a big theme we'll talk about, especially in the ontological foundations. How everything exists, they have that in common. That's the similarity. But everything exists in a slightly different way, slightly different manner, especially different species, etc. So we went through that hierarchy of being, where God is being itself, and then you have pure minds, or pure spirits, and then you have human beings who have intellect and will, but also bodies, and then you have animals, brute animals that don't have reason or will, but have sensation, imagination, memory, etc. We'll go through more of that in the anthropological foundations. And then below that, there's the vegetative life, and below that's just inanimate objects. Okay, so they all exist in different ways, and so being applies to them analogically, meaning they all exist, but they exist in different ways. Okay, so there's kind of a scale of being. Now, we also talked about concepts. So remember, we have the three acts of the mind: conceptualization, judgment, inference. Okay? Conceptualization is the process by which we acquire concepts of things. And judgments are the linking of two or more concepts, okay, by means of the copula, is or the is not. And then the inference is the third act of the mind, which is the linking of two or more judgments together by means of the middle term. Okay, so first we're going to talk about concepts, then we go on to judgments. Real quick review of the concepts. We have comprehension and extension. There's just more terminology here. Comprehension is the unity of its characteristics. In other words, what can we say about the thing? Okay. Extension is how many things does the concept apply to? Okay, so animal has broader extension, has greater extension, but less comprehension than does dog. Okay, dog is more specific. Dog is a species of animal. So you can say more about dog, but it has greater comprehension than animal. But dog applies to less things than does animal, so it has less extension. So animal has greater extension, less comprehension. It applies to more things, but you can say less about what it is. Okay, so being, for example, has the greatest possible extension because it applies to all possible things, but there's very little you can say about it, so it has very little comprehension. Okay, so they're inversely proportional, in other words. All right, So, moving on, definition. There are different ways of giving definition. Division is an important part of definition. Division is setting one thing off from another. Okay? So you're saying this is not that. All right? So, but eventually you want to arrive at what the thing is, right? So first you say what it's not, and then after you said that it's not all these things, well, then you arrive at an idea of what it is. But another way to go about defining things is to give a nominal definition. A nominal definition is an etymological definition, meaning you say the linguistic origin of the word that for the concept you're talking about. Okay, so like nominal comes from the Latin word nomen, which means name. So I just gave a nominal definition of the word nominal. Okay, then you have real definition, which is trying to get at the essence of the thing. Okay, and so you can learn about the extrinsic causes, which would be efficient and final causes. But more essential to the thing itself are the intrinsic causes, the formal and the final. Okay, so if you can arrive at an understanding of the causes of the thing, you can define the thing and understand what the thing is and have scientia or science of the thing. Now, the most radical form of division, when you're saying what the thing is not, is opposition. And there are different kinds of opposition. Remember, we have contradictories, contraries, relations, and privations. Contradictories are mutually exclusive. They're the most possible opposite pairs. Contraries are not mutually exclusive, but they're kind of extremes on a scale. So like hot water and cold water, or black and white colors. Relations are mutually defining. It's like I'm the father of a daughter. The daughter is a daughter of me, the father. Okay, we're defined in relation to one another. And privation is the absence of something that should be there. So we'll talk about evil later on in the course as the absence of a good that should be there. Okay, so that's a quick review. Moving on now to propositions. So we talked about concepts. Now we're going to talk about judgments. Another word for judgment is proposition. Okay. There are different ways you can classify propositions. So, as you notice, we're using the tool of division to define different kinds of propositions. And we're using some of the 10 categories to help divide the propositions off from one another. So, if we use quality to divide the propositions, we get true and false propositions. Those are two kinds of propositions or judgments. All right, the judgment can either be true or false. If we use the category of quantity to divide the propositions into different kinds, we get universal or particular. Don't worry about the others. And then if we use the concepts of material and formal causation to divide up types of propositions, we get, as you see there, necessary and possible contingent. You don't have to worry about those. More important, division according to form, affirmative and negative. Don't worry about modal. Okay? So, then, from that, there's a traditional kind of classification of propositions combining some of these elements. So, leaving aside the division according to quality, true or false, we combine the division according to quantity and the division according to form. Okay, so universal particular and affirmative negative. We get 4 kinds of propositions. So those 4 classical kinds of propositions are universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative. Now what are those? Now, example, universal affirmative. All dogs are animals. I'm making an affirmation about a group, a class, a large class of things. Okay, universal negative. I negate something about a large class of things. All dogs are not animals. Okay, that's not true, but it doesn't matter for the example, right? So, 3 particular affirmatives. If I say Spot is a dog, that's an affirmative about a particular thing. Spot. This Spot is a dog. All right. Particular negative, Spot is not a dog. Okay? Maybe Spot's a cat. Spot is not a dog. That's a particular negative. So, now, if you remember the types of opposition, we had contradictories, contraries. Now we're going to leave aside privations and relations, which have to do with concepts, and talk about and add subcontraries and subalternates in the context of propositions. Don't worry about those though. We'll just look at contradictories and contraries. All right. So, how are these various propositions related? Well, first you have to learn the shorthand. So A stands for universal affirmation because A is the first vowel in affirmative. E stands for universal negative because E is the first vowel in negative. That's how I remember them anyway. Now the third one is I, because that's the next vowel, right? And that's for a particular affirmative. And then the next vowel is O, which is particular negative. So different ways you can remember it, but it goes universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative. Okay, so we have A, E, I, and O. We put this little diagram here to help you understand what we're talking about. So we have column 1, affirmative, column 2, negative. Row 1, universal, row 2, particular. So again, A is universal affirmative, and O is particular negative. Those are contradictories because they could not be more opposite. How are they the most opposite? Why are they mutually exclusive? Well, to use an example, A, the universal affirmative, all dogs are animals. Change that to some, change the all to some, change are to are not, and you get some dogs are not animals. Okay, so they differ both in quantity, because one has to do with all and one says something about some. One is a universal, one's a particular. All right. And we also change the form. In other words, one is an affirmation and one is a negation. Okay. So they're complete opposite, A and O. The same is true for I and E. Okay. Some dogs are animals and all dogs are not animals. Could not be more opposite. Okay. Now, contraries are a little different. Contraries go this way. So horizontally, you have A and E are contraries. So you have all dogs are animals, all dogs are not animals. So contraries are two extremes on a scale. So one is a negation, the other is an affirmation, but they both have to do with the same quantity, the universal quantity. All right. These are below concerning the particular quantity. These are called subcontraries, and then vertically they're subalternates. It's not so important that you know those. But what is important is to know the laws of opposition, at least the first two. You don't have to worry about subcontraries and subalternates. So we learn contradictories cannot both be true and they cannot both be false together. Okay. Ergo, from the truth of one contradictory, you can conclude the falsity of the other. All right. So it can't be true at the same time that all dogs are animals and some dogs are not animals. Okay. And it can't be false at the same time that all dogs are animals and some dogs are not animals. The same thing goes for E and I. Okay. Contraries, the law of contrariety, or the law of opposition concerning contraries, would be that they cannot be true together. They can't both be true, but they can both be false. So if you look at A and E are contraries. All dogs are animals. All dogs are not animals. They can't both be true, but they can both be false. It can be false that all dogs are animals. It can be false that all dogs are not animals. Maybe some dogs are animals and some are not animals. Okay. Obviously, that's not the case because dogs are animals, right? But we're just giving an example of how that proposition works, how that law of opposition works. All right. So we're presupposing here some fundamental principles, though. So getting to something a little more understandable, perhaps, are common sense principles that are at the foundation of all logic. All right? And so the principle of contradiction says that something cannot be and not be at the same time in the same way. All right? In other words, something cannot be true and false at the same time in the same way. That, some people say, comes from the principle of identity. They're more or less the same. That's why I have a slash there. Identity is that being is being and not being is not being. So if being is being and not being is not being, then, well, something cannot be and not be at the same time in the same way. All right. Excluded middle is another way of saying the same thing pretty much. There's nothing between being and non-being. Something either is or is not. Okay. Now, principle of convenience would be a little harder to see. Two things that agree with a third also agree with each other in the same way that they agree with the third. Okay? Whereas, if only one agrees with the third, there's no agreement between the two. So to give an easy example, if A is B and C is B, obviously A is C. If A is B and C is B, then A is C. Okay? Now, to give a more complicated example in theology, you can say God the Father is God, God the Son is God, God the Holy Spirit is God. So they're all equal, they're all God. But they're all the same in one respect, in one way, insofar as they're all equal to God. In other words, by essence, they're the same. But in a different way, in a different respect, they're not equal. And that's by their relationships to one another. So they're only equal to each other insofar as they're all equal to God, but they're each God in different ways. By their relationship to one another, they're distinct from one another, even though by essence they're identical. So there's a difference between substantial predication and relational predication. All right? That's a little complicated, but it's more important that you know the principle of contradiction and then also the two types of inference. Deduction and induction are the two types of inference. Now, logic has to do with necessary syllogisms, necessary inferences. That's what this logic has to do with. So the logic is the science of syllogism, and that's deduction. Okay. Induction is used more in the empirical scientific method. It has to do with probable reasoning, hypothetical syllogisms. So if then, and fulfilling the conditions. So induction is going from observation of particular things. So my pen falls, this cup falls, the desk falls if you push it over. So everything falls. So you generalize. Okay, well, it seems like everything falls. Well, what about in outer space? Nothing, just kind of float around. Well, then you have to, so that's not a necessary conclusion. It's a probable conclusion. Now, induction also occurs when we move from our knowledge of the first principles to then apply them to particular things that we experience. But that's a complicated gnosiological question. Now, just remember that induction is going from the more particular to the more universal, whereas deduction goes from the more universal to the more particular. So, example, all dogs are animals. All animals are furry. Therefore, all dogs are furry. So, we mentioned dogs and furry, and those show up in the conclusion. All dogs are furry. So we'll talk about, why that's the case. But here you're going from something more general. All animals are all dogs are animals. That's a general statement. That's a more universal statement. And in the conclusion, you come up with all dogs are furry. Furry is a more particular thing. So you're deducing a particular truth from a universal truth. Now, last slide, I believe, the various laws of syllogism that come about from this.
don't worry about antecedent consequence. We have a few laws that come about from these things that we've been talking about. So, in order for a syllogism to be valid, there must only be three terms: major term, minor term, middle term. Middle term we've talked about. It's what links the two judgments together. The major term is the more universal of the two other terms, okay? And the minor term is the less universal, or the more particular. Okay. So we have, to avoid equivocation, right, we need the terms must not have greater extension in the conclusion than in the premises. In other words, you can't make here A broader in the conclusion than it was in the first premise, or C a broader category than it was in the second premise. Okay. Now, the middle term also must never show up in the conclusion. So you can't have B here, otherwise there's a problem. Okay. You can't have the middle term in the conclusion. Also, the middle term has to be a universal. Okay, it can't be a particular thing, at least in both cases. Okay. It's got to be universal, at least once, in order to join two judgments together. Because it's got to, something has to include many things before it can join two judgments together. Then you have two affirmative premises cannot give a negative. Okay. So if I say all dogs are animals, all animals are furry, you can't say some dogs are not furry or something. Right? There's no negation there in the premises, so you can't introduce the negation into the conclusion. The premises cannot both be negative. If they're both negative, there's no necessary conclusion. I say all dogs are, ugly, all ugly things. Wait a minute, I need two negatives. So all dogs are not pretty. All not pretty things are not brown. Therefore, what? There's no conclusion from that. Okay, so, and then two premises cannot be both particular. You can't say Fido is a dog and Spot is a dog. Therefore, dog is dog? No, you can't. There's nothing you can say. All right. So, in other words, the conclusion has to follow the weaker part, and you have to have at least one universal premise, and you have to have at least one positive premise. So, if you consider, the negative, the weaker part out of positive and negative, and you consider the particular, the weaker part out of universal and particular, then you have a rule here. You can figure out what the conclusion is without thinking about what you're actually talking about. You can just join these two things mindlessly. Robots can do this. Okay? So machines do this all the time. You can have two universal affirmatives. You can't have two universal negatives because you can't have two negatives. You can't have two particular affirmatives because you can't have two particulars. You can't have two negative particulars because you can't have two negatives and you can't have two particulars. So you got to have a universal affirmative or a universal particular. And then the other one, so in other words, you have to have if you have a universal particular and a universal negative, well then you're going to have a particular negative, because it follows the weaker part of both, the particular and the negative. Okay. If you have a universal affirmative and a particular affirmative, the conclusion has to be a particular affirmative. If you have a universal affirmative and a universal negative, then the conclusion has to be a universal negative. Okay. So there's different laws of syllogism there. The rest I will leave alone.